issue with technology. Okay, I think we are streaming.
All
So,
right.
welcome Kevin to the Anti-Alienation Project. Um, it has been a long time coming, this
Yes, it has.
conversation.
Yeah. Life is crazy. We've been going back and forth a few times to make the interview happen, but we made it happen. So here we are.
We made it happen. Here we
Yeah.
are, and I can't wait to hear your story. I've
Yeah,
seen I've seen you post on a few of the group pages for parental alienation on Facebook, and I can tell you just have this desire to help others, desire to share your story, and hopefully
definitely.
give some people some insight into what it's like for the child's point of view. So,
Yeah, I mean that's really why I'm here. When it comes to these kinds of dynamics, I think that the shared stories are really, really powerful. I believe in awareness, and if my story is helpful for any children who have gone through this, people who are going through this, parents, adults, whatever it happens to be, then I'm more than happy to share. When it comes to my story, the way that if you want to talk about the rules of engagement for it, so to speak, I
mm,
like to say that in the stories of life, there are no heroes and there are no villains. As easy as it is sometimes to make heroes out of parents that are alienated from their kids or make villains out of the parents doing the alienating. For me, the way that I think about it is in the story of my life, there are no heroes and there are no villains. There are just people who do things. And there are people who do things for a wide variety of very complex reasons. But the result of the actions that certain people took in my life is that there was a little boy who got hurt very, very badly. And that was me. And so that's what we'll talk about tonight if you just want me to get right into it.
yes. So one question I have before we get
Sure.
started, and for anyone who's just now joining, please, if you feel called to help us get this in the algorithm and get our message out about parental alienation. It's always helpful to share the video or to like the video, and then more people will learn about what this is, and hear Kevin's message tonight. So you were alienated from your dad. If you could just give the facts real quick, like
Yeah.
from what age to what
Yep.
age?
Yep. So it actually happened a few times, and it started when I was 3 years old. So my earliest memories from childhood involve my dad, and they're all good. My dad and I were very, 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 very close up until about age 3. And I have some very, very, very specific memories of times with him that were very, very good. Weirdly specific stuff that I now remember. But the way that I remember this is one day I just woke up and my dad wasn't there. That's literally what happened. And come to find out, my mom and my dad had a lot of conflict in their marriage, and my mom, when things would get heated, would leave, and she would take me with her. So this happened a few times where they would have a fight, and out of nowhere, my mom would just grab me and would leave. And then eventually, they divorced, and from that point, that's when really the stories began about my dad. Now, the funny thing about it is going back and sort of remembering this, the first things that my mom told me about my dad actually were not that he was abusive or that he was a drunk or that he was a child molester or any of the other things that she would tell me later, by the way. It started with her telling me that he was going to kidnap me. That's where it started. I would ask to see him or would ask to spend more time with him. And my mom would respond by screaming at me, yelling at me, and telling me that my dad was going to come in the night and was going to kidnap me and was going to take me far, far away where I would never see her or my little brother or any of my family again. And when I would get really worked up over this and would cry, she would call a social worker and she would use that to say, this boy's afraid of his father. I think his father may have done something to him. And so it really started at that age, but it continued really throughout my whole life. There were moments when I would have visitations with my dad, and those were normal and good. But it was almost like living a double life because it was almost like with my dad, I could be one person. And then when I would come home, my mom would proceed to tell me things about my dad. Again, things that were really inconsistent with the man that I knew him to be. Um, she told me he was violent. She told me that he had beaten her when they were together, and that's why they had divorced. At a certain point, she began to tell me that he had molested me when I was a child. And eventually, when I got old enough to start questioning that, she would tell me that he had molested, other children, but not me, things like that. Now, what you have to understand, and this is where telling these stories can get really, really difficult, is that you have to think about this through the eyes of a child,
Mhm.
okay? Because as an adult, as I'm telling this, it obviously sounds ridiculous, right? Like, your dad to be this person, and your mom is telling you all this stuff. Like, why can't you just say, mom, you're full of it? A child's brain doesn't operate that way. Children are very, very, very malleable. And the really sad thing is, it is not that hard to brainwash a kid. It's not that hard. Kids will believe all kinds of things, and they're very, very, very malleable. I mean, it's easy to get kids to believe in Santa Claus or all kinds of things.
Absolutely.
And as a child, all you know is that you have a mom and you have a dad, and you love them both, and you trust them both, but your mom is telling you one thing and your experience is telling you something else, and your brain is just trying to make sense of all of this.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So does that answer the question?
Well, so you mentioned that you had an off and on relationship with your dad.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah. So basically, when when he and my mom divorced, I was about 3. And at that point, my mom started to throw out some pretty wild allegations against him. And unfortunately, my mom had access to a lot of money that my dad did not have access to. And she was able to hire a lot of lawyers. And what's interesting about this is I found this out much, much, much later in life. But actually, the reason why my parents divorced in the first place, it didn't involve any allegation of abuse. It didn't involve any of that.
mm,
My mother suffered from a mental disorder called Munchausen's by proxy.
mm,
And basically, what that means is that she believed that people around her were sick when they were not. And she had to put herself into the role of the caregiver to receive validation. And so, with me, from the time I was pretty young, she had started over medicating me. And her two favorite medications were albuterol for asthma and corticosteroids like prednisone. And she used to actually crush up prednisone and put it in my breakfast cereal and put like coffee creamer on it to disguise the taste. And my dad is a very, very, very smart man. My dad is very, very, very intelligent. And he figured out pretty quickly what was going on and tried to convince my mother to get help. And she responded by leaving him. So that's what actually happened. It took
and I'm so
me,
sorry.
yeah, 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 yeah. It's now again, you have to think about this though through the eyes of a kid. As a kid, you don't get this. If your mom says take the medicine, you take the medicine. And that's actually where the child abuse label first began to be applied to my dad. My mother would say, because he's not giving Kevin the medication that he needs, he's abusing him. So that's how the label first began to be used. And then gradually that turned into he's a child molester, he's a wife beater, he's a child beater, he's the scum of the earth. At a certain point, even my mom got really, really, really religious, and it almost took on like a religious bend. She would tell me that my father was possessed by the devil. At a certain point, she would tell me that. If my dad would give me like gifts from when we had been on visitations together, my mom would take those away and would say, "No, you can't have that. Like that's ungodly. You can't have that." And it really does a number on a kid. you know, you're trying to make sense of all of this, and I will say that if you want to kind of divide this up into time blocks, my parents divorced when I was 3. That's kind of when the brainwashing began. And that kind of, I didn't really have a lot of contact with my dad until I was about 6. Then he actually ended up getting a pretty good caseworker, a pretty good social worker who spent time with my dad. And she said, look, I've never seen a hint of evidence that this man is malicious in any way. And so because of that, my dad was able to get what you would consider to be more regular visitations with my little brother and I. And at that point, this is where the story actually gets kind of cool. My dad at this point lived in Kansas City, and my brother and I lived with our mom in Columbia, which is about 2 hours from Kansas City. And my dad bought this plot of land about 20 minutes outside of Columbia and began to build a house out there because he wanted to live closer to my brother and I. And that's where we would have visitations. And his dream was to turn that into a place where we could become men, where we could learn life skills and where we could spend time with him, sort of away from all of the garbage that we were going through at home. And from about age 6 to about age 12, I have a lot of really, really good memories with my dad. Those visitations were incredible. He made me feel safe. He knew me better than anybody. He knew me very, very, very well. And nobody is perfect, though. I will say that. And sometimes what would happen is, and you could hardly blame the man. I mean, if you're getting these kinds of allegations thrown out against you that are not true, you would be forgiven for losing your temper once in a while. So did my dad sometimes, call my mom up on the phone and yell at her? Yeah. But when he would do that, though, then my mom was able to go, oh, see, here's what I'm talking about. Like that's what it is. And unfortunately, when I was about 12, I was on visitation with my dad, with my brother. And around this time, my little brother, who's 2 years younger than me, had developed kind of an unhealthy fascination with fire. He would get a hold of like matches or candles and he would burn things. And he got a hold of a candle, and my dad had been working on this house, this cabin, and my little brother had lit a portion of it on fire. He'd lit it on fire. And in that moment, I saw my dad do something that I had never seen him do in my life. He grabbed my little brother, and with an open hand, he hit him. Now, what you have to understand is, I'm not saying that's right, but what I am saying is it was the only time I ever saw anything like that happen. But my mom had already loaded the cannon, is the
Right.
expression I like to use. And when I saw that, there's fire, there's chaos. Your brother is crying, yelling, dad's yelling. It's chaotic. And when I saw that, there was a part of me that went, oh, okay, so this is what mom's talking about. Okay. And so what did I do with that? Well, I went home and I sat on it for a couple of days. And then I said to my mom, I have something to tell you. Dad hit Kelly this weekend. And what did my mom do with that? She said, okay, tell me the story of how this happened. And so I told her exactly what happened. And then she said, that's not the first time this has happened, is it? No, I want you to tell me about the other times this happened. No, mom, this is the only time it happened. I don't think you're telling me the truth. Tell me the truth. Did it happen other times? Yeah, mom, it happened other times. Okay. Was your father drinking when this happened? No, no, mom, he wasn't. No, no, no. He used to drink all the time. He had a problem with that. He was drinking when he did this, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, mom. And he didn't use an open hand, did he? He used a fist, didn't he? Tell me, actually show me how he used a fist on your brother. And he's hit you before too, hasn't he? And she did this with me for weeks. And eventually, when the story got to the point where she wanted it, she put me in front of a lawyer and a judge, and I accused my father of child abuse, which he was not guilty of. And that broke me. Now, when that happened, what I now understand is I had been developing PTSD for a while from this experience, but that was the final straw. And when that happened, something in my brain changed. And all of those good memories that I described of my dad went away.
Mm.
And I didn't have access to them. Or if I did have access to them, I didn't have any emotional connection to them. There's something called emotional amnesia that can happen. And what I now understand about the dynamic is essentially when I stood in front of a court and accused my father of that, I was killing him off in my mind. That's what I was doing.
Mm.
And that was heartbreaking. Now, my dad did not stop fighting. And at that point, there were court ordered family therapy sessions with a family therapist. And at the time, I did what just about any kid who is going through an alienation dynamic does. I I fought it with everything I had. I went in there and I remember, going into those sessions and saying the most hateful things about my dad that you can imagine. I mean, I told him I hated him. I told him I wanted him dead. I told him, I said absolutely awful things about him. And he never once retaliated, not once. He was calm. He said, Kevin, I know you don't mean that. Um, and it was actually in that session where that particular therapist, his name's Greg Sisk, he figured this out in about a month and a half. After about a month and a half of these court ordered family therapy sessions, he went before the court and he said, these kids have been brainwashed.
Wow.
That's literally what he said. Now, unfortunately, again, my mom had access to a lot of money and a lot of lawyers. And at that point, she had a team of 3 lawyers working for her who tore this poor counselor up and kind of shredded his testimony about all this. And these family therapy sessions went on until I was about 17. And then at that point, my dad actually almost out of mercy said, these kids have had enough. I'm gonna back off, was what he did. And from about 17 to 18, I didn't have any contact with him at all. Now, what's interesting about this is it's interesting how your subconscious, your unconscious, it's going to come to the surface somehow. And with me, the way that happened is when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, I had a full ride scholarship to go to a university in Chicago to study. And at the last minute, I turned it down. And I said, no, actually, I think I'm going to go to the University of Missouri in Columbia. Which, again, now at the time, I had no idea why I was making that decision. I did it at the last minute. It was a spur of the moment thing. But when I rolled up into Columbia, the first place that I went to was the land.
Wow.
20 minutes outside. And I didn't know why I was going there. I just went there. And it continued to be a place where I would continue to go back to it again and again and again and again, even though I fervently believed that my father was a monster who had abused me.
Wow.
I kept going. And again, I never stopped to ask if this place was such a hellhole for you, why do you keep going back? That's not what people with PTSD don't go back to the places where the bad thing happened. They avoid those places. Now, with me, there was some avoidance, but it was actually avoidance of my dad. So he would call me up, and I would find an excuse not to see him or an excuse not to talk to him. And he would badger me a little bit. I'm your dad. I'm not going to be around forever. Come see me. Write me a letter. Those things. And I remember at one point in particular, I was 19, 20. I was doing my studies at Mizzou. Out of the blue, my dad just called me up and he said, I haven't seen you in a while. Just let me take you out to breakfast, And I said, all right, Dad, I'll let you do that. And he took me out. But the spot that he took me to was this spot where we would get dropped off for visitations. And we always ate breakfast there. It was the exact same spot. And that was where he took me. And we just sat down and ate breakfast together. And it was almost like, this is so hard to describe, but it was almost like there was this space, this wall between us where it was almost like I was numb to him. I didn't hate him, but I just didn't feel anything at all. And now, in spite of going through all this, I grew up. And in spite of the difficulties of childhood, I grew up. Eventually, I made the decision to go into ministry because I wanted to help people. And I became a pastor. I went and got my master's in divinity in St. Louis. I got married to a wonderful woman that I love dearly, who has been just a rock through all of this. We were married for 10 years. Well, it's kind of like, hey, honey, there's some stuff I got to tell you that's like that you don't know about, and she's been so wonderful through it. We've got 3 amazing kids. And, in spite of all of the challenges, I grew up and have a pretty good life. But what never stopped, I guess, haunting me is the word that I would use, was this feeling of loss, this feeling like I had lost something, this feeling of sadness. And when it would really come out, when I would get a day off. And I wouldn't really have anything to keep myself entertained. I wouldn't have anything to keep myself busy. I didn't have any distractions. That was when those feelings really began to come out. One question that I get a lot, I'm sure people are going to ask, is how did you figure all this out? And that's what I'll get into now, unless you have any questions about anything that I've just kind of said.
Well,
I know that's a lot.
I I do have a few questions if you don't
Sure.
mind,
No, go ahead.
before we get into that point. Um, you've just shared a lot, so a lot
Yeah,
comes to my
that's a
mind.
lot.
Um, and you talked about the false allegations and
Oh,
you
yeah.
mentioned the Munchausen by proxy.
Yep.
Um, I guess on the Munchausen by proxy point, I was wondering if that continued and
Oh, yeah.
until
It
what
did, yeah.
age?
So it did. So my mom worked in healthcare. She was a nurse, like a lot of people with Munchausen's are. And it was one of those things, again, it's almost like playing detective. You start as you get older, there are some things that you start to see that don't really add up. And it really started with me seeing the way that my mom medicated herself.
Okay.
She would carry around just bags and bags and bags and bags of medicine anytime we went anywhere. And the only thing that I knew for sure that she had was lupus. She did have lupus, like that was true. But after growing up, I had known other people who suffered from that, and they did not have medication to the extent that my mother did. I mean, it was a
Oh,
lot of medication. And I remember when I really started to question, my mom's kind of medical knowledge of things. I remember again, I was in college. I was in my 20s, and out of nowhere, my mom called me up, and she said, "Oh, Kevin, I've got really, really bad news. The dog has lupus." So we had a little cocker spaniel, and I said, "Mom, that's crazy. I was just home 6 months ago. That dog was fine." And she said, "No, no, 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 no. Like I know what lupus looks like, and that dog has lupus."
oh
And I
man.
said, "Well, did you take the dog to the vet?" And she kind of got angry with me, and she was like, "What are you talking about?" "No, I know what lupus looks like. We're going to take care of the dog." And what ended up happening is she gave the dog prednisone. The dog blew up to the size of a balloon and died. So she ended up killing the family dog. Now, it took me a while to figure out that that's actually what had happened, but that's what happened. Um, and it was also just kind of seeing the way that she desperately needed to be the caretaker. Now, my mom had a lot of other issues too. She lied a lot. And the thing about her, though, is it's hard to say that she was a malicious liar because she believed what she was saying. To her, that was her reality. She believed things about reality that were not true.
Yeah.
In her mind, my dad really was the devil. And the thing that we now know about parental alienation is that parents that are doing alienating are often reliving their trauma through their kids somehow. They're projecting that. And my mother was adopted, and so my mom, when she did eventually find her birth family, but when she found them, um, the guy that her dad ended up being a real letdown. He was not a good guy. And I think that some of that was she was projecting that into my experience
Okay.
somehow. So, but yeah, it continued her whole life. Up until the point that she died. She died 4 years ago of a heart attack. And my personal belief is that that was because of just too many medications. With corticosteroids, that's what that'll do. It'll damage your heart long term, and I think that's what happened. So,
Okay. Thank you for clearing that up.
yeah,
I've been interviewing people and doing research on this for 2 years, and I've seen a big overlap between those who have a delusional belief about the other parent, as well as a
yep,
delusional belief about the medical reality of their
yeah,
children. And Munchausen
definitely,
by proxy seems to be a very common thing that these parents also do to their children. And I think it's tricky because they isolate the kid and they're able to get away with more of that because they've isolated the kid.
yep.
So I feel for you a lot. Do you think you could give a little bit of an explanation or a frame the dynamic between you and your mom?
Yeah. So this is where this gets really tricky because what I realized pretty quickly when all of this came to the surface
Hmm.
is that I had some very, very, very positive, affectionate, loving feelings towards my dad that were severely repressed. And I had some feelings of absolute hatred for my mom that were also severely repressed, and I had to get all that out. And so that was part of this whole process. I mean, my recommendation for anybody going through this, whether you're an adult survivor, a parent, find yourself a really good therapist, because you are not prepared to deal with the extremities of emotion that you're going to feel when you're going through this. But eventually, once I kind of worked through all that, and it was almost like going through the stages of grief. They talk about that, the depression, and then the anger and the bargaining and all of those things. I got to a point of forgiveness with my mother. I did. And the way that I was able to do that is eventually I came to see that she was not a terrible person. And I actually do have good memories with her. I do. I'll tell you a few good things about her. She was a very talented musician. That was actually authentically her. She was very, very gifted. I mean, if you put a piano in front of this woman, she could play anything. She was a very, very good singer. And on that point, we could connect. I play guitar. I love music. And so when it came to music, she and I could talk. And I have a lot of good memories of those conversations with my mom, talking about, Jimi Hendrix and the music of the 60s that she grew up with and those kinds of things. I loved that. My mom was a very charismatic person. I mean, when she was younger, she was drop dead gorgeous. Blonde hair, blue eyes. She looked like something out of, like a California surfer girls video or something. I mean, she was absolutely stunning, and she had charisma. And that was actually part of what made her such a good alienator. She could make you believe anything. I mean, she was so convincing in how she would do things. And in the right framework, she could have actually been very, very good at, team building or management or something like that, where you have to influence people in that way. She could have been very good at that. But unfortunately, it went in a very dark direction, that kind of side of her personality. Um, the real challenge with my mom and I is, I think deep down inside, she knew that there was a part of me that was never going to fully reject my dad, and not fully. And she resented that. So for that reason, there always was that friction between us. She would even say at times when, if I would get angry at her, she would say, "Now you're reminding me of your father right now." She would say things like that, and as if like, my father was just the worst thing that you could be, and you better not be that. Well, you can't separate yourself from your father, but you also can't separate yourself from your mom either. So I think that for somebody going through this, you could very easily create a problem for yourself by rejecting your alienating parent. You don't want to do that either, because that's just as bad. You are your mom and you are your dad. They both make up the person that is you. And the harm that comes from parental alienation is that it forces a kid to deny a part of themselves. And so once I was able to work through those feelings of anger and resentment, I went to my mom's grave, and she was buried in Missouri. When I made kind of my first big trip back home to reconnect with my dad, one of the things that I did was I went to her grave. I didn't go to her funeral. When she died, we hadn't spoken in 2 years.
Oh, wow.
And that really that happened because of when I started to have kids of my own. I began to see her trying to influence them in a certain way, and that protective, Papa Bear kind of came out of me. And when you set boundaries with a narcissist, which my mom was also that, they don't like that. And so when that happened, she kind of wrote me off, and I said, okay. And then unfortunately she died before we had a chance to resolve or reconnect or any of those things. So does that make sense?
Oh, everything you're saying is like right out of my life too. So I totally
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
Um, I do have one question
Sure.
just to really talk about what it's like for the child going through it. So for anyone, I'm sure you know this, but for anyone who might be new to this topic, if you convince a child one of their parents is bad, they usually internalize that and come to believe they're not good enough or they're bad too. So what can happen is that plays out throughout that child's teenagers, young adults' life with different self-destructive effects. Did you notice any of that as you grew up?
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things about this is when I reconnected with my dad, I was going through a bunch of his old stuff, and I actually found some tape recordings of me when I was a little boy. The earliest one was from like 1988. And they were interviews with somebody that I assume is like a court appointed social worker or a psychologist or something. And I listened to those tape recordings once, which was really, really triggering for me. But once I had listened to them once, I kind of handed them over to my therapist and said, if I keep these, I'm just going to obsess over this. I really need you to kind of hang on to these for me. And based on some of the behavior that I was showing just on those recordings, it's pretty obvious that I was developing PTSD by the time I was 4 or 5 years old. That was really when that started. And I think that comes from a place where if you can convince a child that they're not safe with one of their parents, that that's an unsafe place to be, that's deeply, deeply traumatizing, especially if it's not true. Even if it is true, it's traumatizing. But especially if it's not true, that makes it even more traumatizing because then the kid is put into a situation where, okay, this parent that I'm supposed to trust is telling me I'm not safe with this parent, but I feel safe here. So what's going on over here? Am I really not safe over here? And it really deprives them of that sense of security and safety that a kid should have. And so that manifested itself in a lot of different ways as I got older. The biggest thing it was in the area of memory, and you can kind of understand why that would be when you're forcing a kid to kind of block out certain parts of their memory. That's going to manifest itself in adulthood. And with me, it looked a lot like ADHD. That's what it looked like. As it turns out, I don't have ADHD at all. It's PTSD from this kind of thing. But and then of course PTSD manifests itself in all kinds of different ways. I mean, I had a lifetime of migraine headaches and stomach issues
Oh, yeah.
and those kinds of things. Now, I will say though that the really incredible thing is since reconnecting with my dad, I was on medication for migraines. I was on medication for ADHD. I was on medication for hormonal imbalances and a handful of other things. I'm off of all of it.
Wow.
And I feel great. I feel better than I ever have in my whole life.
Yeah.
Since reconnecting with my dad, and that was 7 months ago, I haven't had a single migraine. And a lot of those things are radically, radically reduced. It's not perfect yet because the recovery process from PTSD can take a long time,
Mhm.
and we're still working through some of those things. But just that initial release of, oh, okay, so that's what happened to you. That was enough to really get me a lot of relief. So, does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely. Yes, it makes absolute sense to me,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah,
So can we go back to when I think we left off around the age of 19 or 20 when you were in
yeah,
college?
yeah.
So,
So, yeah, so at that point, my dad was desperately trying to reconnect to me. And he did that in a variety of ways, letters, phone calls. He did that through like spontaneously, showing up and trying to visit with me and those sorts of things. And I would avoid him. I would always find a reason to not write him or not call him unless I absolutely had to. If he would do this thing where he would call and call and call and call and call until I finally would like pick up, and then he would kind of chew me out a little bit, but not too bad. But he would say, you really need to, call me more often. And I think that the challenge for him is that he knew exactly what was going on. I mean, my dad's a very, very smart man, but at the same time, he also wanted me to have a relationship with my mom. He desperately wanted me to have that. And I don't think he was fully aware of just how much dishonesty I was being fed. I think he knew there was some of that going on, but I don't think he knew the full extent of it at all. And so he was kind of blindsided by some of this. But eventually, when I grew up and began to have kids of my own and that sort of thing, I just sort of wrote everybody off. I said, okay, don't need my dad, he's no good, but don't need my mom either, she's no good. So I'm just going to do this my own way, okay? And I just sort of cut everybody out of my life and said, I'm just better off without them, and this is what I'm going to do. And that was kind of how I lived my life. When I reconnected with my dad recently, we hadn't spoken in I think 12 years.
oh wow.
And based on our reconnection, I was able to facilitate a reconnection between my little brother and him. And he and my little brother hadn't spoken in like 25 years. So it had been a lot longer for them. And and so I don't know where I was going with that. Sorry, I lost I lost my place there. What was I talking about?
No,
It was,
you were talking about how you got married and
oh
then
yeah. Okay, so that was really I had kind of cut him out of my life at that point. And in spite of, all of the challenges of childhood that I've grown up, and I felt like I had done well for myself, but there were still these, I guess, these emotions, these residual emotional effects that were coming out from that I didn't even know were linked to that. I had no idea. And the way that this would usually come out is, ministry is hard and it takes a lot out of you and it takes a lot of time. And most of the time, I was able to sort of distract myself by just working at kind of a breakneck pace. But anytime that I had a day off and I had to just kind of sit with myself where I didn't have anything to distract me, I would get really, really sad. And I would have these feelings of almost like a loss that would come up, like I had lost something or I had left something undone, or like I was stuck, was kind of how it felt. And finally, one day after a particularly bad weekend, I said to my wife, I said, "Honey, I think I need to talk to somebody about this to try to work through this." Now, what was crazy about this is this was one of the questions I get the most is, "How in the world did you discover the truth?"
right.
And what I can say is, I believe in God, and I believe this was the most spiritual experience I've ever been through by far. Nothing compares to it. Even if you don't necessarily align with that belief system, you can at least understand if you've gone through something like this and you finally do kind of discover the truth, you have that aha moment. It was almost like, the universe was saying to me, yes, this is right. This is the right move. Keep doing this. This is what you need to be doing. Um, so I went to therapy, having no idea that any of this was kind of locked back from my childhood. And when I first went in, my wife said, "How do you feel about talking to a Jewish rabbi?" And I said, "It sounds like a lot of fun. Let's do that." I don't know any rabbis. That would be great. And that was the first time I met my therapist. His name's Rabbi Roll. He's a very, very good guy. And we sat down together, and he said, "Tell me why you're here. Tell me what's going on." And I started to describe all these feelings that I was having. And I thought we were going to talk about like the stress of ministry and spending time with hospice patients and how that can wear on you and those sorts of things. I really did think that's what we were going to talk about. And he just kind of let me talk for probably 30 minutes. And then he just puts his hand up and he goes, "Kevin, stop." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I know what's wrong with you. Would you like to know?"
Wow.
And I said, "That's definitive. Like, you've known me for a half an hour. He said, "No, no, 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 no. I know what's wrong with you. This is what you have to understand, Kevin." And he said, I'll never forget this. He said, "You have a soul, and that soul was given to you by God. And that soul is eternal, it never ends. But inside of that soul is every single person that you've ever been and every single person that you'll ever be. And at a certain point in your life, there was a kid that felt isolated and alone and angry and sad and stuck. And you never got past that. You need to go find that kid
Mm.
and you need to allow him to say the things that he has never been allowed to say. Until you do that, your soul is going to bleed. And that's what you're experiencing right now." And I'm listening to this and I'm going, this sounds like the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I almost walked out and he was like, "No, no, 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 no. You need to sit down." And he said, "Here's what we're going to do. I want you to try this." And he laid me down on his couch and he said, "I want you to pick a memory where you felt these feelings that you're feeling now and try to make it as early as you can." I said, "All right." So I picked a really specific memory and he kind of put me into this place of relaxation. And I started to feel something. And I couldn't really describe it, but it was like, oh my gosh, okay, so I'm feeling something and I don't really know what this is. And I don't really know how to describe this, And then he kind of stopped and he said, "Okay, we're going to stop this today. But what I want you to do is I want you to wait 3 or 4 days and then I want you to do this again. But this time I want you to make sure that you're with people that you feel safe with, because sometimes when you have things locked away in your unconscious, when it comes out, it can be kind of messy." And I'm thinking, like, how bad could this possibly be
Oh
at that
no.
point? Yeah. And so I did exactly what he said. But he added something. He said, this time, try to see if you can get that kid to talk to you. And I said,
Mm.
okay, so like the kid version of me is going to talk to the adult version of me. He said, exactly. See if you can get him to open up to you. And I said, all right. And so I waited 3 or 4 days, and then I picked a specific time. The kids had gone to bed, and I said, okay, honey, I'm going to go into this bedroom and I'm going to try this, and we'll see how this works. And she's like, okay. And so I laid myself down. I picked the same memory, and I remember pretty clearly. Visualization is pretty powerful. But I saw myself as a kid, and I was 12 years old, and I went up to that kid, and I said, anything that you've got to say, you say it to me, okay? Because I'm going to keep you safe. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to shame you. Anything that you need to say, you say it to me because I am safe. And I swear this is true.
Mhm.
In my head, it was almost like I didn't have control over it. That little kid reached up and kind of grabbed me by the head and pulled my head down like that and whispered into my ear, I miss my dad.
Oh.
And as soon as that, I swear this is true. As soon as that happened, it was like later on, my wife, she thought I had been shot because of the sound that came out of me. It was like a wounded animal. It was just like all of a sudden, all of these memories that I had lost came pouring back into my head all at once, and I could see clearly. And I was sobbing. I was crying so, so, so hard. And I cried out and I said, honey, I need you. Come in here. And she comes in there and she grabs me. I was shaking and I couldn't talk for a solid probably 45 minutes. And then finally I looked up at her and I said, honey, I've got some things to tell you that I've never told a soul. And I proceeded to tell her the story that I told you tonight. And the next couple of days were rough. There was a lot of crying, and a lot of processing. And finally, I said, okay, I got to call my dad. And I did. And it was incredible. We hadn't spoken in 12 years. And he's just, Kevin. And I said, Dad, I know you're happy to talk to me, but I need you to just listen right now because I need to tell you what happened. And I told him about all of this, and he was crying, he was sobbing, and he said, Kevin, you have never been far from me. You've never been far from me. And when he said that, I just broke down and I said, Dad, I love you. I've always loved you. And it was incredible. And about 2 weeks later, I got on a plane in the middle of a blizzard so I could go see him. I mean, it was like everybody, I live in Maryland and I had to go back to Kansas City to see him. Everybody was saying, like, don't get on a plane. It's dangerous. I said, nope, nope, nope. Like, I'm into this. I'm seeing my dad. And I got on a plane right in the middle of a blizzard and I got down there and reconnected with him, just spent a lot of time with him. When I saw him, I mean, it was just
Yeah,
instant,
what
like,
was that like when you saw
I
him?
went up, I literally went up to him and I grabbed his face and I was like, Dad, I love you. And we are so, 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 so good. And he looked back at me and he said, Kevin, I never had any doubt that we were good, and it was just incredible. It was funny, even like when I got to Kansas City, it was like 2.5 feet of snow on the ground. And my cousin Ron, who's actually a lot more like a big brother to me, was around and he's got a big truck that can get through just about anything. And I said, I'm here. We've got to go back to the land. We have to go there. And he said, Kevin, we're never getting in there. And I said, yes, we are. We're going. So we literally all piled into the truck and we went down to the same land and like the cabin was still there. Like it was falling apart. It was absolutely falling apart. Like the
Oh,
roof had caved in. And this is the really incredible part. I got inside. Like I had to like climb the wall to get into it. And when I got into this old cabin, there were all of these pictures all over the wall of me and my dad when I was little. I mean, it was like something out of like a novel or something. I mean, I posted a lot of the pictures that I posted on some of the Facebook groups are from that. It was from seeing that. There was a picture of me like up on my dad's shoulder when I was a kid, and me on this like bike that he used to bike around with me. And I collapsed on the floor. I was sobbing. I was crying. I was thanking God for for the experience, for the reconnection. And since then, I've made 2 more trips back to Kansas City with my kids. So the second trip was with me and my son. He's 7 now. so that he was able to meet his grandfather. And that was just absolutely incredible. I took him back to the same land, not with like 3 feet of snow on the ground this time of spring, but he was able to run and play in the same areas that I did when I was a kid. And then just recently, my wife and our daughters went with us the next time, and so he was able to meet all the grandkids all at once, and it was just nothing but love. My little brother came with us; they reconnected. It was just absolutely incredible. So that's the story. you know, any questions or anything about any of that? I know it's a lot. It's a very, very, very big story. yeah,
Yeah, you got me tearing up over here.
yeah, yeah.
In the best way though. Oh my goodness. So your dad, it sounds like, welcomed you back with open arms.
With open arms, yeah, yeah.
Made it
He had been,
easy for you to
yeah,
reconnect.
he'd been, I think, praying for this for a long time, and he was stuck in the most lose lose of all lose lose situations. If he pushed too hard, he was going to lose me. And if he didn't push at all, he was going to lose me. And so, what my dad did very, very, very wisely, and the only way I can really, the only way I can characterize it is, it was almost like he left clues for me to find, knowing that one day I was going to find them.
Yeah.
It was almost like he did that. It was almost like they were like little, like a trail of crumbs that I was supposed to follow. Where eventually, after following that, I would find like the answer, and that was eventually what happened. I think that the pictures in the cabin were a part of that. I think he very intentionally put those there, knowing that someday I was going to see them.
Mm.
That's the only explanation I have for like the actual pictures that he chose and where they were arranged and where they were and all those things. And the fact that nobody had really been inside this cabin in over 20 years, and they were still there. I mean, they had withstood the test of time and all of the wear and tear of the weather. They were still there, which was just amazing. So,
What a powerful, powerful story. What a
yeah,
dad. Sounds like
yeah,
a great, very resilient person. Um,
yeah. He's tough, and I think that he's a very, very, very smart guy. He's very, very, very well educated, and when I did eventually reconnect with him, what was interesting is I started really looking at his bookshelf because my dad's a big reader. And there were all these books on psychology and on divorce dynamics and even some books on different personality disorders and things like that. So clearly my dad was like reading about this stuff, trying to make heads or tails out of the craziness that was happening around him. But I think that what I saw upon reconnecting with him is he had trauma of his own from the experience, and by reconnecting with each other, we were the healing that we both needed. He helped me heal in the best way possible, and I helped him heal in the best way possible, which has just been, I mean, it's just been incredible. I wish it would have happened a lot sooner. And one of the struggles that I still have is that feeling of like I was robbed. Like there were all these major life events that my dad really should have been a part of that he was not able to be a part of because we were alienated from each other. That's what alienation does. It robs kids of a really, really, really important part of their life that they're not going to get back. Um, Now, at the same time, it's hard to really speak into the mind of an alienator as though they're a sane person because they're not. You can't, you can't speak of an alienator as though they have the ability to entertain rational thought because they don't. So I can say all day, why can't an alienator just wake up and see the consequences of what they're doing? But that's the whole problem in the first place. They don't understand the consequences of what they're doing. They're not capable of that kind of empathy. They're not capable of that kind of rational thought because they're not in their right mind, frankly. So I don't know.
so can we go back for a minute, if you don't mind, to
Yeah, please.
that exercise your rabbi had you do, and
Yeah.
back when you
Yep.
were seeing that 12-year-old version of yourself, and I
Yeah.
remember you said, did you say, I miss my dad? I
I
need
miss
my
my
dad?
dad. Yeah. That's
I
what he
miss,
said to me. Yeah.
I miss
Yeah,
my
and come to find out, it's if you've ever heard the expression inner child healing,
dad.
that's what we were doing. And it's a very, very, very powerful form of therapy. I actually think for anybody going through an alienation dynamic like that, find a therapist who knows how to do this because it's very, very, very powerful. And for me, later on, it was actually a technique that I could continue to use. Once I had kind of tapped into that, then I was able to say, okay, what were you feeling when you were 15? What might you have repressed then? What was that kid not allowed to say at that point? And
Mm.
that was when a lot of the feelings about my mom started to come out, where there was a lot of anger there and that I wasn't allowed to express. In my home, my mom had to be the hero. She had to be the caretaker. She was a narcissist, and so a lot of that had to come out. And still to this day, I still use that technique. I check in on the kid every once in a while just to make sure that he's okay. There's a With alienation dynamics, there's something called fragmentation that happens. And I think it's not the same thing as like full blown dissociative identity disorder, although that can happen.
Mhm.
But what happens is that when a child's brain comes up against something that they can't make sense of,
Mhm.
there's a splintering off of the self. So part of the self is repressed. That part of the self that loves dad and knows that dad is amazing and wonderful and all of these things, for the child's own safety, that part of the self is repressed. And then there's this other part that kind of comes out that for their own survival, they're aligned to the alienating parent. And so then now there's a conflict. There's a part of you that really wants dad, that wants to be close to him, but then there's another part that says, no, you can't do that. And
Mhm.
so that fragmentation happens. And in therapy, what makes the inner child exercise really, really powerful is that's what allows, both sides to kind of say what they need to say, and then you can kind of come together, right? And then you can have that wholeness that you're seeking, that oneness that you're seeking. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yes. I guess I'm wondering how you got from the powerful feeling of knowing that you missed your dad to the realization that you had been manipulated and
Oh,
abused.
that's a good question. So basically, what happened is that I did not, when all of those memories came flying back, I did not yet know the term parental alienation. I didn't know what that was.
Mhm.
All I knew was that I had been lied to about a lot of things, and it had radically altered my relationship with my dad. So you have to remember, all of this came out after like one therapy session with this rabbi. So I go in for like number two, and I say to my wife before I go in, I say, if I walk in there and he like takes off the mask and says, hi, by the way, I'm Jesus Christ, I'm going to go, okay, finally, like I've met you. Okay. Like it was really on that level. And so I go in there and I said, he's like, so how you doing? And I said, I need you to tell me something. I need you to tell me how you knew what you knew. And he kind of smiled and he said, why do you need to know that? And I said, well, because I care about the truth. That's what I care about. And he said, so you're a truth seeker, are you? And I said, yeah, I'm a truth seeker. And he said, okay, let's talk about that. And I said, okay, well, this is the truth that's come out. Let me tell you all about this. And so I started describing this
Mhm.
childhood to him. And he started crying in front of me. Like he just was like, I mean, it was like the color went out of his face. And he came over and he sat down next to me and he kind of put his arm around me and he said, Kevin, that's not okay. That's child abuse, what happened to you. And I said, it is? And he said, yeah, that's child abuse. And he said, by the way, and it also has a name. That's called parental alienation. And
Mhm.
the reason I know that is because a friend of mine that I worked very closely with was involved in a custody dispute in which there were dynamics like the one that you described. And the judge listened to 5 hours of testimony from this therapist that I know and another therapist. And based on their testimonies, the woman that was doing the alienating lost custody of her kids for that. And I said, wow. And he said, yeah, so we've got some work to do here.
Mhm.
And so that was when I first learned the term parental alienation. And so that was when kind of my own research on the topic began. I discovered your channel, which was really,
Oh,
really
really?
helpful. There were a couple videos from Dr. Childress that I listened to, the big long lectures. I listened to those. Those were really helpful. There were a few other, there was a Teal Swan video I remember that was like, when I listened to that one, I was like, wow, like that's exactly what happened to me. There was kind of that moment. And the struggle that I ran into, though, was I found a lot of resources out there for parents,
Right.
but I didn't find anything like if you're a kid who went through this,
Right.
you survived, and you've come to terms, and you're trying to come to terms with this. Like, how do you get past this kind of trauma? And there just wasn't very much out there. I mean, maybe that's why people like you and me exist,
That's
so
why
that,
we exist,
that maybe
Kevin.
that's what we're doing. I don't know. So, eventually, I think I do want to find a way to tell the story in a way that's healing, maybe a podcast or a book or something like that. But I'm not there yet. I'm still working on my own healing through all of this, and so I want to make sure that I'm in a good place before I tackle something like that. But it's definitely a desire that's there. So, but that was how I first learned the term. And what was interesting about it is that I had mentioned the family therapy sessions that were ordered by the court when I was a teenager. So I remember thinking, well, I wonder if this therapist that was involved back then still practices. And I called him up. I actually found him and called him up. And I said, I don't know if you remember me at all, but this was what happened. And he said, unfortunately, I don't remember you. But the reason I don't remember you is because I had literally 1,000 cases just like that one. And the term, and I had used the term brainwashing, and he said, no, it's not brainwashing. That's a loaded term in the court. It's parental alienation. So he used it after my therapist had used it. And so there was some validation there too, where he was seeing the same kind of dynamic even back then. So,
Wow. Did you
yeah.
have any did you have any anger towards your mom or towards a therapist or
Oh,
towards
geez,
anyone who
yeah.
enabled this?
Yeah. There were times when, when all this first came out, there were days when I would just go and like lock myself in my car and just scream. I mean, there were times that I screamed myself hoarse, at my mom. And when you're recovering from something like this, you got to allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you're going to feel. Um, I would have these moments of where I would just cry, and it wasn't like regular crying though. It was like my face would grimace almost like I wasn't in control of it. I remember at one point it was so intense that I bit down and cracked a tooth in the back because I bit down so hard. That was really early on. And what they don't tell you is when you have trauma stored up in the body, it has to leave once it starts to be released. But in my case, that was not so pleasant. I mean, there were nights where I was throwing up from it.
Mhm.
I had to go to the hospital at one point because there was like a vein in the back of my leg that had blown up. I told the doctor what I was going through, and he said, "Yeah, that's probably what caused that. It's nothing to be too concerned about, but that's what that is." And so, your body has to release that somehow. And yeah, definitely feelings of anger towards my mom, no doubt. And those are still there, if I'm being honest. But I think now it's tempered with the understanding that she was not an evil person. I do have good memories of her that I can hold on to, and I can treasure those. And there were times when she acted like a mom towards me. I did have good experiences with her. I really wish that she would have gotten the help that she needed. She was a severely, severely damaged person.
Mhm.
And at the end of her life, she died alone and miserable.
Mhm.
And I can empathize for somebody like that. I can. The What's interesting about it is that the alienation actually backfired. And at the end of her life, she was estranged from me. I wasn't speaking to her. So she tried to kind of keep me all to herself. And in the end, that actually backfired and ended up kind of blowing up in her face. And so now when I look back on her, I do feel very, very, very sorry for her. I pity her. I wish that she would have gotten the help that she needed. She grew up in a day and age when we just didn't know as much about mental health as we do now.
Mhm.
So she had her own trauma that she dealt with her whole life. And really, the only thing that separated me from her, I mean, I was living in a delusion too. I was lying. I didn't know it, but I was lying too. I stood up in front of a court and told the entire courtroom that my dad was a monster. Uh, the key there is becoming aware, knowing what you're doing, understanding your actions and the consequences of your actions. And my mom just never got to that point. So
Did having kids at all change your perspective on your parents or your upbringing or open your eyes at all to this experience?
a little bit.
No.
I think that more than anything else, what having kids did was I knew from very early on that I wanted their experience to be different than mine. I knew that much. Now, I did not have everything in its right place. I did not understand that um, the person that had actually been the abuser in my life, it was sort of backwards in my brain. I was still thinking of my dad as an abuser and my mom as basically good, in very, very, very like black and white ways. But I did know that I wanted my kids to have a different experience than what I had grown up with. And I also knew that it was important to be honest with them. I understood that much. And what was interesting was when I had reconnected with my dad, there were some things that I had told my son about him that were not necessarily true. Now,
Mm.
I had not said everything that my mom had said, but I had some things like, well, dad hurt daddy when he was little, and that's why we don't talk to him. And eventually it was interesting with him. I had to be really, really, really careful about it. But I kind of took him aside and I said, how how sometimes people can be mistaken about something. You know what that means? They're confused. Have you ever been confused about something? He's like, oh yeah, daddy. I said, well, let me tell you about my dad. And he's like, well, I thought your dad hurt you. And I said, well, that's not really the full story. Would you like to know the full story? And he's like, oh yeah, I like hearing stories about you, daddy. And I said, okay, let me tell you a story. And that was how we started approaching it. And it actually didn't take very long for him to kind of get it. He's like, oh, okay. All right. Well, I want to talk to my grandpa now. And I said, all right, I'll put him on the phone with you. And it was like, no time flat. He was like just the most natural thing in the world. It's like, okay, I haven't met him in 7 years, but so what? I'm okay with it. I've got him now. And so that was, but I also understand, I think now, having worked through the trauma, any trauma that we haven't worked through, we're going to somehow manifest that through our kids, and that's not okay.
Mhm.
We need to be the adults in the room, and very, very, very bad things happen to children when adults act like children and children are forced to act like adults. Very, very, very bad things happen when that's the dynamic. And so I don't want my kids to have that experience. So now doing the work of going to therapy and coming to terms with this really, really, really difficult stuff. It's really, I mean, it's for them. I don't want them to have to relive this experience. And I would even say now, having, been in therapy now for 7 months, working through all this, I'm a better dad. I'm definitely more patient than I used to be. I understand the way that children think a lot better. Even my wife has been able to kind of process some stuff from her childhood. So now she's kind of seen the effect that it's had on me. And so now she's kind of said, okay, I've got some stuff that I need to work through too. That's helped us with our marriage. I mean, and it helps us be better parents, all of those things. And so I think it's almost like the healing is contagious, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
It just kind of flows out, and it's a really beautiful thing. So
That's amazing. I
yeah,
have two more questions for you,
yeah,
and then
please,
we can open it up to a few questions from the
sure,
live chat if you're okay with that.
yeah.
Um, in the reconnecting with your dad, so far, what has been something that has surprised you, if anything? What's been the most surprising element?
He was exactly the way that I remember him. So there was nothing about his character that was surprising to me. But I guess what was a little interesting was just how much he actually knew. I was telling him all this as though it was this big major revelation. And his response was like, oh, Kevin, I've known all that shit for years. Like, it's like, so that's kind of that's the sort of I guess if you want to call it surprising, but also just the amount of like patience that this man had,
Mm,
actually understanding the full story and seeing what he went through. This would be enough to drive anyone out of their mind,
mm,
and yet somehow he was able to keep it together. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that after he and my mom divorced, he found love again. He was with Connie, his wife, for almost 30 years after that, and then she had actually died about a year before my dad and I reconnected. So the reconnection happened at a really, really good time because he was about as low as he'd ever been. I mean, he had lost this really incredible, amazing person, and reconnecting with me, I think, kind of gave him a spark that he needed. But he had those things in his life that were able to kind of keep him going, and I'm really, really grateful for that. But just the resilience of this man. I mean, just the absolute resilience of him, and the depth of character that he actually has was really, really, really incredible to me. And seeing the way that he bonded to my kids, kind of immediately, he bonded to them, and that kind of reminded me of, okay, I was that age once.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
that kid climbing up into his lap. That was me actually back then. That kind of thing. So,
Yeah, those are beautiful moments. I love those moments.
mhm.
Did he ever try to tell you what was going on or hint at what was going on?
Yes, he did. But the way he would do it, he would suggest things without like going kind of over the top with it. So when I was younger, you can't say to a 6-year-old kid, your mother has Munchausen's by proxy and she's giving you medicine that you don't need.
Hmm.
You can't say that. But what you can say is, hey, Kevin, your mom says you have asthma. Do you think that's true? I'd say, well, yeah, my mom says I have asthma. It must be true. Well, that's not really what asthma is. I've done some reading on this. Would you like to know what I've found out about this? Oh, okay, yeah, okay. Well, you can have a cold and it's like that. You don't need all these treatments, that kind of thing. So he would suggest things like that without coming all the way over the top and saying, your mom's crazy. He would suggest those things because again, I mean, even to this day, when I reconnected with him, one of the first things he said to me was, I loved your mother dearly, and she was not a bad person.
That's
Even like, yeah, he was just the forgiving spirit of this man was just incredible. Like she abandoned him. She took basically everything he had, and yet still his heart was love and forgiveness. And so that's why I say for me, it was probably the most spiritual experience I've ever had. Seeing the face of God through my dad and that kind of love. That's who God is to me. It's that kind of, forgiving, loving father who loves us unconditionally. And so for me, it's strengthened my own sense of faith. It's made me better at what I do. Yeah,
that's just beautiful.
yeah,
Um, and then I'll just end on the question I like to ask everybody that I interview.
please.
So, and feel free to take a few moments to think about this, but if you could pick the most important thing that you would like people to know about this psychological child abuse, what would it be?
It's got to stop.
Yeah.
It's that simple. It's funny in my own research into the subject. It's interesting that parental alienation is kind of a loaded term, but that's why I think I appreciate some of what Dr. Childress has put out about it because the fact that it's happening has never been the thing that's controversial. Like, yes, it happens. The controversial thing is, what do you call it, and whether you call it what's the term, a syndrome or not. That's what's controversial. The fact that it's happening is not controversial. Of course, it happens,
Mm-hmm.
and we have the terms that we need to describe the dynamic. Um, I think that awareness is key, which is where your voice and the voices like you are very, very, very important. Thank you for what you do, by the way. It's important. It makes a difference. But I think just the awareness of understanding that kids don't reject their parents. That's not a natural thing that children do. And so if you see that, you need to immediately start asking questions. To me, that's I think the important thing. It's got to stop. And it's got to stop because, frankly, I was one of the lucky ones. How many kids don't have the chance to connect with their dad? How many kids are another Kevin Scott and their parents are dead by the time they figure all this out? And then they have to deal with a lifetime of remorse and guilt that they should not have to carry because it's not their fault. You know, it's just got to stop.
Yeah.
It's that simple. It's got to stop. Um, I think that the legal system needs to be a lot wiser about this. I think there needs to be more education among family therapists about this kind of thing. Um, look, the dynamic happens. I can only draw on my own experience. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, but it was enough to give me full blown amnesia and PTSD. And I was one of the lucky ones. For a lot of kids, the consequences can be a lot worse. And I think that if my dad had not kept trying to re-engage with me, the consequences for me could have actually been a lot worse. I think the reason why I turned out comparatively normal
Me
compared to
too.
some people that go through this is because he never stopped trying to get me, you know. So does that make sense?
Again, this is all making complete sense to me.
Yeah,
Yeah, it makes total sense to me. And I think part of this is to change things for our own kids and leave a
yeah,
better legacy for our own kids.
yeah. The most important thing is look, tell the truth. Don't
Mhm.
ever lie. Lies are the most damaging thing in the whole universe, I'm convinced.
Yeah.
And we need to be truthful. We need to be truthful with ourselves. We need to be truthful with the people around us, and we need to be truthful with our kids. Um, you know, in these high conflict divorce type situations, there needs to be honesty. There needs to be integrity, and there needs to be, I think, even education for parents that are going through that with each other. You know, you need to encourage a positive relationship with the other parent, even if that's difficult. And if you don't, you could screw this kid up for life. You know, so there's a lot of work to be done there.
Well, I just can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your story. I have been glancing at the live chat throughout this conversation, and so many people have just expressed their gratitude, and you're a gift for
No, no,
sharing.
no. That's I'm humbled.
Yeah. I mean, not many people are brave enough to even speak out about it if they are able to learn the truth to begin with. Are there any last thoughts that you have before we open it up to questions that other people have on your story or your message, anything at all? And how can people support you in your healing journey?
Yeah, so it can be a really isolating experience if you're going through it. Don't try to do it alone. If you're a parent, if you're an adult survivor of this, find yourself a really good therapist that can help you work through the very, very, very complex emotions that come with this because you cannot do it alone and you can't do it without a really, really, really good support network around you. If you can find a support group, that's great. I've got a really, really good one that I attend kind of sporadically, where there's adult survivors in there too. There's not very many of us. There's four or five, but that's been really good. That's been really healing. And don't isolate yourself. The alienation alone is a very isolating experience. And the remedy for that is to find a safe place where you can share, where you can open up, and where you can bring all this stuff to the surface and discuss it. And if there's mutual healing that happens from that through shared storytelling, then that's amazing. That's a gift, you know. So yeah, I mean that's the best advice I can give. My prayers are with anybody going through this. It's not easy. It's actually I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, but you know if you're going through it, uh, just know I remember, I can't remember what video it was that I was watching, but the person said, remember that you've got a couple of very, very, very powerful allies on your side, truth, love, and healing. And those are very, very, very powerful. And in my case, that's definitely been true. The truth will have its day. It might take it a while, but the truth eventually has its day. You can't suppress that forever. So,
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I
yeah,
think that
sure.
is really important to remember. So for anyone who's here in the live chat, go ahead and leave your questions if you have any. I have two to start with that I've seen.
Yep,
Somebody asks, Kevin, how old were you when you testified that your dad was abusive and you, oh, that was the first
yep.
question that I
Yeah,
had.
so I was, let me think back to that, 15. So my mom had taken me away from my dad when I was 12 and then had kept me from him so I was between 14 and 15, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yep.
It's a really difficult time in anyone's life, 15 years old.
Oh, geez.
Um,
Yeah.
but to have to
Yes.
do that.
Yep.
And did you realize the lies in the moment or only in retrospect? I think
Only in
you're referring to
retrospect.
that.
Only in retrospect. Because what you have to understand is that when I was 12, that was when I had seen my dad it hit my brother. And again, I still don't believe that he was abusive in any way. He should not have done that, but it was an emotional reaction to a very emotional situation. Um, but once that happened, I was taken away from my dad, and my mom kept me from him for about 2 years, where there was no court involvement whatsoever, and she was just kind of able to pump into me whatever she wanted at that point. And so it that was when really the recreation of the story, if you will, would continue, and eventually the story grew and grew and grew and grew and grew until by the time I got in front of a court, I was telling him that my dad was a drunk and was all these other things that he was not at all. And in my mind, that was my reality at that point. There's something that happens, and I think that there's a few different channels that talk about this, but when a kid is in an alienation dynamic, they're in a fused state with the alienating parent
Yeah.
where their self is actually repressed. So all of the thoughts and feelings and emotions that the alienating parent is feeling, that's all being filtered through the kid. And that's what I experienced. So in the moment, did I understand that those were lies? No, 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 no. That was my reality at that point. Now, at the same time, though, I felt really guilty. I felt shame. I felt sad. I still, all the feelings were still there. I just didn't know why they were there. And they were there because I wanted my dad, and I knew that he wasn't any of these things. So,
Yes.
yeah,
From watching Dr. Childress, I think that that might be the persecutory delusion imposed on the child.
yep, yep, yep. That's exactly right.
Oh, it's so funny that somebody just said that. Somebody literally just
Persecutory
typed that.
delusion. Yeah,
Yeah.
that would actually be a really, really, really good name for like a death metal band. Persecutory delusion.
Yeah. And that's what it feels like too, right? Like a
Yeah,
death
yeah, it
metal
does. Oh yeah,
concert.
yeah, coming all down on you. Yeah,
Oh
absolutely.
my gosh. I'm glad we laughed throughout the interview as well.
Yeah, if you
Um,
don't, if you can't, well, you either cry or you laugh about it. That's kind of your choice. Or sometimes you do both at the
yes,
same
I feel
time.
that in my soul.
Yeah,
It's definitely made me a funnier person. So we have a few more questions. Thank you everybody for the questions. I love that people are engaging, and go ahead and like the video if you can. If that would really help us get it in the algorithm and
like and
inform more
share.
people about how destructive this really is. Um, so Kevin, this is a good question. I didn't ask this question. Did you get alienated from your grandparents and that side of the family too?
Yes. So it was actually, and not just my grandparents, but that whole side of the family. So eventually, everything that my mother was telling me about my father became enlarged to include that entire side of the family. So not only was my father a
Mm.
child molesting, wife beating drunk, but actually all the Scots are that way. They're all that way. Which again, come to find out, none of that is true at all. No, the Scots are a very eccentric, eclectic bunch of people that I love very, very much. And unfortunately, I never met my grandfather on that side. He was unfortunately kind of kept away from me through all this. But it was interesting that when I was reconnecting with my dad, my grandfather was a very, very talented poet. He wrote absolutely gorgeous poetry. And in going through my dad's stuff, I found some of my grandfather's old poetry and I kept it. So I kind of have a kindred spirit there now. And so now whenever I'm writing about this stuff, I almost feel like that's, kind of my grandfather, channeled through me, if you will. That sounds weird, but
No, I just
yeah,
got goosebumps. That's
right.
beautiful.
Yeah, so that's my connection to him. Really, really, really gorgeous stuff. And so the healing and the love was contagious. Reconnecting with my dad also meant reconnecting with all these amazing, amazing, amazing people that I had been just distanced from for so long. And they were just like my dad. They took me back with open arms and were so happy to see that I had discovered this, and hearing about a lot of things that I sort of remembered from childhood from their perspective
Hmm.
was very, very, very telling as well. It was very affirming for a lot of the things that I was kind of remembering. So,
Yeah, that's important. I also did the same thing. Talk to other family members.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, oh yeah,
Um, Someone asks, did she ever try to replace him with a boyfriend or
yes.
stepfather?
Stepfather, yeah. So that's a very, very, very complex subject. So she remarried when I was 6,
Okay.
and my stepfather and I have a very complicated relationship because on his own merits, he's not a bad guy, but my mom married him very intentionally trying to replace my dad. Very, very, very intentionally trying to do that.
Hmm.
And my stepfather kind of fell into that role. And I resented that. And so that created friction between he and I growing up. And I didn't even know where the friction was coming from. I just knew that I didn't like him. And it was because for me that term dad was always going to be a really sacred one. And I was not going to apply it to just anybody. And I refused to apply it to him. I wouldn't do it. Even to this day, I don't call him, I call him Mark when we talk. And it's not because I don't hate him, but it's just that he was brought into our lives for a very intentional reason that I'm not even sure he was fully aware of. I'm not even sure he understood what he was really biting into. I think he went into that marriage with the best of intentions. I think that he does legitimately love me. I do think that. And he had ways of showing that through the years, but he also was not really equipped to be a stepdad in the way that a stepdad should be a stepdad, if that makes sense.
It
So
does. It
yeah,
does. Maybe that was you refusing to call him dad. Maybe that was part of you,
that's exactly yeah. Yep,
yeah.
that's exactly it. Yeah, it was because it was sacred to me. Even when I was completely backwards in my thinking about my dad, I was, that was still a sacred word for me. So
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Somebody asks whether you have found uh sorry, I missed that question. Someone says, you mentioned your father communicating just enough. What types of things did your father say or write to you when you were strongly under the influence?
yeah, so he would write me letters, and he would try a number of different tactics. He would call me. His tactic with the telephone, by the way, was just to call me and call me and call me and call me until I would finally pick up, and then he would sort of chew me out a little bit, and then we would talk. But the letters were interesting though because I went back and reread a bunch of them that I just had lying around, and understanding now what I understand, the phraseology in them became a lot more important. And
Mhm,
I could see that he really was trying to lead me in the right direction without beating me over the head with it.
mhm,
So at one point, I remember there's a letter that I actually have in the other room that I saved, and he had written it, and in there at one point he said something like, the next time you go to a health screening, just ask the doctor about asthma and ask if that's something that he thinks that you've struggled with. So like those kinds of suggestions. If he could kind of poke a hole in one piece of dishonesty, then I think his hope was that eventually I was going to put the pieces together and come back to, okay, so if she lied to me about this, what else did she lie to me about? And eventually that's what happened. That is actually eventually what happened. That was kind of the way that it went. When all of it kind of came to the surface, there was this process of just deconstructing every single thing my mother had ever told me, not just about my dad, but about herself, about my family, about all kinds of things that I had to put under a microscope. And I had to ask, does this actually make sense? And what came out was there were some things that were true, there were some things that were half true, and there were some things that were flat out not true. So does that make sense?
It really does. Because you wonder, there could be some exaggerated truth, some bits of
Exactly.
truth, and
Yep.
then some flat out lies. It's hard
Correct.
to differentiate um what is real and what is not to some degree.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to end if you feel good about
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. No, no, no. I do feel good. Yeah, thanks for having me on. And again, to anybody out there going through this, my heart's with you. Keep fighting. I know it's a struggle. I know that at times there are no easy answers to this, but if you're a parent, love your kids. That's the best advice I can give you. Find a way to love your kids and find a way to make sure that they know that.
Excellent. And is there any way that people can support you?
Um, that's actually a really good question.
Your healing or any type of
I think so.
work?
My belief is that healing is contagious. So I think that if people find their own healing, somehow that impacts me and my healing. So go find some healing, and that's the best way that you can support me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for
You're
sharing
very
your
welcome.
story. It's been very powerful, and I feel very grateful to have had you on tonight and
I'm
talked to you.
humbled.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, and we'll talk to you next time.
Yep.
Bye.